back in. Today, we're going to be discussing our week 9 must start sit running backs for the week. Let's get into it. We're going to start with our must starts first, and we're going to hit off with Bijan Robinson against the Dallas Cowboys. Now, obviously, no matter what, you're starting Bijan Robinson every week, but I did want to touch on him this week just because of how his slow start and how he's really started to turn things around. Like I mentioned, over the first 5 weeks of the season, Bijan was only averaging 13 fantasy points per game. Now, however, over the last 3 games, Bijan is now averaging 22 fantasy points per game. And on the season, he hasn't really seen the type of workload that we were hoping to see. I mean, the coaching staff really talks about this over the offseason and during preseason and training camp about how that they wanted to utilize him like Christian McCaffrey. This really hasn't happened. As while he has played 64% of the snaps, he's only handling 52% of the rush attempts and an 11% target share. Now, he has been efficient with his touches, coming in at 7th in missed tackles forced per attempt and 23rd in yards after contact per attempt. But I think with his recent trajectory, if he continue this pace, he is going to be a top 5 running back rest of the season. And honestly, with this next matchup against the Cowboys, he could definitely keep this going because the Cowboys have definitely been on a downward spiral as of late. The Cowboys have allowed 166 rushing yards and over a touchdown per game over their last 4. They've also allowed the 6th highest explosive run rate, the 2nd lowest stuff rate, and their 2.56 yards before contact is the highest rate allowed in the league, making Bijan an easy top 3 running back play this week. Next up is Aaron Jones against the Indianapolis Colts. Aaron Jones is averaging 18 touches and over 100 total yards in his first season with the Vikings. Even at nearly 30 years old, Jones remains one of the more efficient running backs in the league, as he's currently 18th in yards after contact per attempt, 9th in yards per touch, and 7th in yards per route run. This week, Jones gets a great matchup against the Colts, who have allowed the 8th most rushing yards and have allowed the 11th most PPR points to position. Next up is James Cook. Now, it's definitely been a rocky road, at least the last couple of weeks here for James Cook, but he definitely came out and put up a big number last week, putting up 28.3 fantasy points against the Seahawks. On the season, Cook right now is the RB9 in fantasy points per game, and he's done that despite being 22nd in opportunity share. Really, the only frustrating part with him has been the 8.4% target share, which is pretty underwhelming. But one thing that we definitely love to see is that he has scored 8 touchdowns. That is already more than he scored all of last season. So now this week, he does get another really good matchup against the Miami Dolphins, who have been gashed over the last 4 games, allowing 130 rushing yards per game and 3 touchdowns. They've really struggled to limit big runs as they rank 7th in explosive run rate allowed and have missed tackles at the 4th highest rate in the league. Cook is a low-end RB1 for me this week. Next up, let's move over to DeAndre Swift against the Cardinals. After a really horrible start to the season, Swift has come back to be one of the best running backs in the league. Over his last 4 games, Smith is putting up over 100 total yards and 1 touchdown in every game and has been a top 10 running back every single week. He ranks 12th in explosive run rate, 14th in yards after contact per attempt, which is what propelled him to put up 22 fantasy points per game. As long as Swift can remain healthy, he's going to be a viable low-end RB1 on most weeks. This week, he looks like a high-end RB2 against the Cardinals defense that has allowed the 7th most fantasy points to position. Next up is Chuba Hubbard against the Saints. While Hubbard has been one of the best draft day steals, he has started to slow down over the last couple of weeks. Last week, he finished with only 71 total yards on 17 touches and no touchdowns, finishing with 9.1 PPR points. Either way, his usage remains among the best in the league with a 70% opportunity share, which ranks top 12. He's also 8th in total carries and 11th in targets, and his 4.9 true yards per carry ranks top 12 as well. This week, though, he gets an incredible matchup against the Saints, who over the last 4 games who have allowed nearly 200 rushing yards per game and nearly 2 full touchdowns per game to running backs. So Hubbard is an easy top 15 running back this week. Next up is Tony Pollard against the Patriots. Pollard had another decent performance last week against one of the tougher run defenses in the league. He finished with 117 total yards on 23 touches, but failed to find the end zone. He did finish with 14.7 fantasy points and is now the RB20 on the season in fantasy points per game. This week, Pollard gets an incredible matchup against the Patriots, who have allowed 166 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns over their last 4 games. Their 2.09 yards before contact is the 9th highest rate in the league. And they have also allowed the 3rd most PPR points to running backs. And Pollard and his 70% opportunity share is a must-play this week. Next up is Alvin Kamara. Kamara continues to see one of the strongest usage rates in the league. He's handling 74% of the opportunities and seeing an incredible 22% target share, which is absolutely insane for any running back. While he hasn't been particularly efficient on the ground, or averaging 3.9 true yards per carry, and he is also 40th in yards created per touch, it doesn't really matter if he's going to continue to see this type of workload in the passing game. I mean, to sit here and see him just once again continue to smash through the air, and honestly, with all the injuries they've suffered with Rashid Shaheed going out, Chris Olave in and out of the lineup. I don't really see how it changes all that much. And there is a chance that Derek Carr could return this week, which is only going to bump him up. But I do think if Derek Carr comes back, I think he becomes much more of a high end RB1 play this week. I just don't really love the offense as a whole and his ability to be able to score touchdowns without Derek Carr in this lineup. So, because this is an incredible matchup, the Panthers have allowed 160.5 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns per game over their last four. And on the season, they have allowed the most PPR points to the position. So keep it moving. Let's move over to Brian Robinson against the Giants. Robinson has been one of the most reliable fantasy options this season, as he has been a top 24 running back in 5 of the 7 games this season. He's done so handling 61% of the opportunities, which ranks 24th. His 14.1 fantasy points per game ranks 22nd. And on a per touch basis, he's been really efficient, ranking 14th in yards created per touch, 12th in evaded tackles, and 23rd in explosive run rate. Where he has lacked his involvement in the passing game. Over the last 3 games, he's only been targeted 1 time, which is why he's only seeing a 6% target share on the season. So that has certainly been frustrating. But his ability to punch it in the end zone has been one of the biggest reasons why he is averaging the 14.1 fantasy points per game. This week, Brian Robinson gets a very strong matchup against the Giants, who have really started to struggle against running backs. The Giants have now allowed the 6th most rushing yards, the 8th most touchdowns, and have allowed the highest explosive run rate allowed over the last 4 games. Robinson should be viewed as a strong RB2 play this week. Next up is Kareem Hunt against the Bucs. Now, Kareem Hunt's usage has been incredible since joining the Chiefs. He's averaging 21 carries per game and 77 rushing yards. His 72% opportunity share ranks 9th highest among all running backs. He really hasn't been utilized, though, in the passing game. He's only been targeted 7 times through 4 games, which results in only a 5% target share. He's already racked up 14 red zone touches and has 4 touchdowns, which is a big reason why he's averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game, which is ranks 12th highest among all running backs. This week, the Chiefs play the Bucs on Monday Night Football. This sets up to be a very good matchup, as the Bucs have allowed a 5.3 yards per carry, which is the 5th highest rate in the league. They have, though, a limited opposing running backs, only 1 touchdown over the last 4 games, but he still makes for a pretty strong play this week against the Bucs. Now, next up is going to be the Giants running back situation. Now, if there was any question heading into Week 8 who the Giants' #1 running back was, I don't think that's really a question anymore. Tracy dominated the backfield touches and had his best game of the season. He finished with over 145 rushing yards and a score for 20 fantasy points while playing 62% of the snaps. This was a very encouraging start against one of the most stout run defenses in the league. He did so, unfortunately, leave with a concussion. This will be definitely a situation to monitor. But then playing on Monday night, now having a short turnaround play on Sunday, I don't think Tyrone Tracy is probably going to play. We'll have to monitor the situation. If he does, he becomes an easy top 20 running back for me this week. If he is forced to miss, though, I do think Devin Singletary would step right in, because this is a good matchup against the Commanders. Over the last 4 games, the Commanders have allowed 142 rushing yards per game and 5 touchdowns to running backs. And they've also allowed the 6th highest yards before contact. So I do really like the Giants running backs this week, whichever one it is. If Tracy is able to play, obviously we've already talked about that. If not, Devin Singletary steps in and is top 24 running back play this week. Lastly, I just want to hit on a couple maybe flex options, players that I have ranked outside of my top 24, but I think you consider playing this week. First up is going to be Nick Chubb. Now, obviously, he's working his way back from a brutal knee injury, but we've seen him ramp up from 11 carries and 3 targets in week 7 to 16 carries and 2 targets in week 8. Well, he hasn't produced a monster game. He has looked better than I really thought he would. This is not the best matchup, though, for Chubb, as the Chargers have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs. But with him seeing 18 to 20 touches per game, he's going to be a viable flex option every single week. Next up is Rico Dowdle. Now, he did miss week 8 with an illness, but he's expected to be back this week. Dowdle gets a decent matchup against the Falcons defense that have allowed 4.8 yards per carry, which is the 10th highest rate in the league over the last 4 games. So I do think Rico Dowdle could be also somebody you can look at plugging in this week, especially with a couple bye weeks that we have going on. Next up, let's move over to the sits of the week, and we're going to start with J.K. Dobbins. Now, this really depends on your situation, but I don't mind sitting Dobbins this week. This is not a favorable matchup against the Browns. The Browns have the 7th highest stuff rate in the league, and their 1.58 yards before contact is one of the lowest rates in the league. They've also allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs. If you have better options, I think Dobbins is definitely a consideration for sitting this week. So let us know in the comment section below if you have any questions. We'll definitely be willing to help you out any way we can. Next up, let's move over to the Bucs situation. Well, Rachaad White has been very viable the last 2 weeks. I do not think any of the running backs are great plays this week. With all 3 running backs splitting touches, it's already going to limit their ceilings. And now they get to face one of the best run defenses in the league. The Chiefs have been absolutely dominant against running backs this year. They have not allowed any running backs to get to them, and their 13.6 fantasy points per game to running backs is absolutely incredible right now. And this is just not a defense I want to play running backs against. If I had to choose one of them, it would be Rachaad White, and that's just because of his involvement in the passing game. So if you're playing in PPR formats, Rachaad White would be the only one I would even consider. Next up, let's move over to Tank Bigsby and possibly Travis Etienne. Bigsby has been really solid 3 of his last 4 games and has really taken advantage of the opportunity with the Travis Etienne sideline. However, he's also had some very favorable matchups the last few weeks. This week, though, the Jags traveled to Philadelphia to take on a stout Eagles run defense who has allowed the fifth fewest fantasy points to running back. So this is just not a matchup I really feel like playing Tank Bigsby. Now, I will say the Eagles have struggled against pass catching running back. So if Etienne was able to come back, maybe you consider playing him. I just don't really love the situation for either one of these guys this week. If you have better options, again, might look to sit both of these guys. Next up is Javonte Williams. While I love the matchup for Bo Nix and his pass catchers against the Ravens this week, I am not nearly as excited about the running backs. The Ravens have only allowed 55 rushing yards per game and in the sixth fewest fantasy points in position. I would avoid all Broncos running backs this week. And then lastly, we're going to hit on Raheem Mostert. I could probably include Devon Achane in this, but he's far too explosive for me to even think about sitting. But the Bills' run defense has really improved drastically since the start of the season. Now, if you were just to go look at most, just generic fantasy points allowed stuff, you will see the Bills have allowed the second most fantasy points to running backs this week. However, I wanted to start zooming in a little bit and how these defenses have done over the last 4 games. And this is one great example of this. The Bills have allowed the 3.73 yards per carry, which is the fifth lowest rate in the league over the last 4 games. They've also have the second highest stuff rate, and their 0.96 yards before contact is second only to the Chiefs defense. So their run defense has really started to turn things around. I am not excited whatsoever to play Raheem Mostert. I wouldn't play him. Yes, he could possibly do what he did last week, where he had 9 carries for 19 yards, but he found the end zone twice. That is not something I would expect every single week. And just since he's not really involved in the passing game, I really don't have any excitement to play Raheem Mostert. He's a definite sit this week for me. Now, I will say on the Devon Achane side, obviously you're not sitting Devon Achane, but I will say he definitely gets the better matchup of the two because where the Bills really have continued to struggle is allowing pass catching running backs to get there through the air. So definitely that is where Devon Achane would shine. So definitely Devon Achane. I definitely still view Devon Achane as like a low end RB1 this week. Just don't expect as much from him on the ground. So that being said, if you have any questions, like I've said, let us know in the comment section below. We'll be happy to get answer for you so we can get them W's this week. Fantasy playoffs are only 4 or 5 weeks away. It's kind of crazy how quickly the season is going by. But that being said, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.